not? Now, the issue is this can lead to problems if one form of treatment actually contradicts another form. Um, but in some cases, they could be reinforcing. The point is simply that being sick and doing something about that sickness when it occurs is a lot more fluid, it's a lot more varied, it's a lot more complex than most of us sort of acknowledge. So, Brown and colleagues provide a number of sort of what they call basic approaches in medical anthropology. And they talk about these as sort of biological, ecological, and evolutionary approaches, and critical, ethnomedical, and experiential approaches. And they group these under kind of two broad framings: the sort of biosocial approaches that we might call the biological, the ecological, and the evolutionary. They're kind of more material-based approaches, and the cultural approaches: the critical, the ethnomedical, and the experiential. A little bit more about both belief systems and power structures. Um, and then as sort of separate areas that they pulled out, which aren't really so much kind of theoretical frameworks or theoretical approaches, but they're areas of study within medical anthropology that deserve a mention in their own light, is this anthropology of biomedicine and applied anthropology. Now, when we speak of these basic approaches, and particularly these theoretical approaches, the point is, or should be, that each offers an emphasis or a starting point from which to engage inquiry. But they're not mutually exclusive, and sometimes one's subsumed under the other. They're just different orientations to shape the way you ask and pursue a question. So, for example, I use a biosocial approach more, or more precisely what I call a critical biocultural medical anthropology. But sometimes I call it a political ecology of health approach, or maybe just a critical medical approach. Um, the labels don't matter so much as the kind of questions you ask and the methods you draw on to get at an answer. But if I'm using a biosocial approach, it doesn't mean that I'm not interested in the experiential approaches. I'm not interested in the ways they experience and make sense of disease. I want to know that too, and I hope to draw on those as well. But it simply means that what's orienting my general inquiry may be more within this sort of biosocial realm than the sort of phenomenological or experiential realm. The idea of offering sets of perspectives like this is that they're tools to draw on and frameworks to draw on. If they're useful, great. If they're not, use others. You shouldn't feel limited or that you have to adopt one particular way of seeing the world theoretically within anthropology and then just stick to that. So this slide just sort of outlines in a little more detail some of the differences between the approaches. The biological approach obviously pays more attention to things like genetics and physiology, nutrition, and the way stress impacts the immune system, the way disordered immune systems affect susceptibility to disease and the severity of a particular disease. And it pays a lot of attention to sort of evolutionary underpinnings of the way we are vulnerable and or respond to diseases. And an example might be, there's many examples one can draw on, but one of the ones commonly used is the sickle cell or sickle cell disease, which is a chronic, incapacitating, even deadly sort of disease that's due to an alternate form of a gene for hemoglobin, which is the molecule in red blood cells that binds with oxygen and carries oxygen throughout the body. So red blood cells that have this different form of hemoglobin don't carry the same amount of oxygen. They tend to clog arteries and joints. They cause a lot of long-term problems. It's a disease. It's a debilitating disease, or it can be. But it arose because the frequency of this sort of genetic alteration in hemoglobin in some areas of the world helped impede the spread of the malarial parasite in the body when people were exposed to malaria. And so people who had sickle cell alleles or full versions of a particular gene, if they had one of their versions of the gene like that, but not both, so all the blood wasn't sickle, just some of it, those people tended to survive and be healthier and reproduce better and so forth in conditions of extreme malaria that were prevalent and still are prevalent in many parts of the tropical world. And so we find sickle cell in some parts of the Mideast. We find it in Africa, especially. We find it in southern Italy. It's in a number of places. Now, Brown, also within this biological approach, speaks of thrifty genotypes in diabetes. This idea that we might have a gene predisposing us to, or some groups might, to obesity and diabetes. That affects their sort of genetic ability or enhances their genetic ability to store carbohydrates more efficiently. It proves problematic in well-fed groups, and the idea is that in evolutionary history, some groups that experienced many occurrences of kind of famine and seasonal famine and starvation might have developed or accentuated the presence of this particular sort of genetic form. But there's also a lot of reason to not to put too much credibility in this notion of thrifty genotypes. More recently, there's been a much more emphasis, this is all still within biological approaches, on what's called the fetal origins of a thrifty phenotype. The idea that as the body develops as a fetus and in the days and weeks and years right after birth, it develops in such a way that predisposes it to, again, a sort of hyper efficiency in storage of carbohydrate, particularly through a different functioning of the insulin system. And that this creates a sort of context for later adulthood sort of development of both obesity and diabetes. And this is really part of what's sort of a new and growing area within biological anthropology and biological approaches to medical anthropology, which is an interest between what's sometimes called fetal stress in adult health, or DOHAD, DOHAD, the developmental origins of health and disease. And the whole idea here is that we know now that stresses that the fetus feels or stresses that occur early in life end up shaping health outcomes much later in life. And this is a sort of a new growing area of research. Now, the ecological approach that he mentions here, this interaction between environmental context and human health, pays a lot of attention to the role of the physical and social environments on health. Things like mining, things like job exposure to different kinds of toxins, things like the presence of DANS and schistosomiasis that they mentioned in Applied Medical Anthro. The degree to which things like clear-cutting forests create pools of water for mosquitoes to breed that increases the rates of malaria. The fact that we're in a world now where climate change is a foregone conclusion, and that climate change and global warming have a lot of impacts, including how the degree to which tropical diseases are spreading much farther north than they used to. So populations that were never exposed to these diseases may start getting exposed to them. The way in which, particularly in the Northeast, how we all started, on the one hand, settling in building our communities and our homes much more in the woods because of a love for nature, and also sort of limiting or promoting practices which led to sort of growth in deer populations, were all part of what seemed to stimulate this kind of development and spread of Lyme disease that's fairly prevalent in the Northeast as well as other places. We talk about ethnomedical approaches. Traditionally, this has been the study of medical models and systems in non-Western and indigenous cultures, often contrasted to the sort of real biomedical knowledge or the kind of traditional versus modern medicine. And yet we try to not make those same sorts of differences, but to understand the medical systems, the belief practices of people within their cultural context, and also using, as I mentioned before, sort of an emic perspective. But this sort of ethnomedical approach often has Also been involved with sort of cross-cultural analysis, which is common in anthropology, um, to look at how different kinds of healing regimes or explanations for illness kind of arise in different sorts of cultural contexts in different parts of the world, and try to see if there's a pattern to those. But more recently, the whole notion of ethnomedicine has been kind of reformed, or not sort of reformed, but the distinction between ethnomedicine and biomedicine has been reformed, and that we now kind of more readily, and this is something we'll talk about later in the class, recognize biomedicine as simply another ethnomedicine, but it's an ethnomedicine of Western-based, often capitalist cultures. Um, and it's sort of an ethnomedicine of a sort of modern, a particular scientific worldview, that's part of a Western worldview as well. We'll talk more about that a little bit later. Now, critical medical approaches initially were really developed very much as a sort of political economy of health approach, one that takes account of the larger global political economic forces like colonialism that change relations between people and the environment, created more and greater social and economic hierarchies and inequities that then are reflected in different patterns of health, sometimes called health disparities. Um, and also looked at sort of how other relations of power, relations between poverty, inequality, racism, sexism, class, and so forth, impacts the health experience and the frequency of health problems in different groups. Now, in another sense, critical medical has focused on the sort of questioning the power of biomedicine, of knowledge creation, the very sense of knowledge creation. Who gets to create knowledge, and how is it created? Of basic understandings of biomedical knowledge, the idea of sort of universal bodies and the mind-body separation, is part of assessing what's sort of real in terms of health and disease and so forth. And then you have the sort of experiential, or sometimes experience near, or sometimes called phenomenological approaches that really focuses on how folks perceive, experience, suffer, and make sense of health. And this is communicated through their stories, their narratives of illness and suffering. Now, each of these kind of theoretical approaches here, I'm not trying to go into too much detail on, because we're going to follow these up much more closely, and with more examples in the next 2 weeks of the class, because this all comprises the first module, which is the first 3 weeks of the course. The one other point I simply wanted to add here is that these different theoretical approaches, as I mentioned, are not mutually exclusive. And so as we look for ways to combine the different approaches, we often come up with these sort of hybrid approaches like critical biocultural, which is sort of combining both perspectives from a political economy, so that aspect of a critical medical approach, with human biology, also with a critique of science around versions of the body, around assumptions of evolution and adaptation, and so forth. And this critical biocultural has much in common with what we might call a political ecology of health, which is a kind of version of an ecological perspective, but also with political economic factors added in, or a focus on power relations added in. We also talk about critical phenomenological, an approach that's still focusing on personal experience, but acknowledging how this personal experience is shaped by relations of power and dominant cultural and medical perspectives. Now, the two other perspectives that they mentioned here are really, as I said, less sort of a theoretical orientation and more sort of an area of study. One of these is the anthropology of biomedicine, or the way biomedicine works as a medical system and as a cultural system. They're often critical, but not always critical of biomedicine, but really the goal is to expose this here. Now, biomedicine is obviously an effective way to treat health issues. It has great global reach and acceptance. It's rooted in, very much rooted in notions of science. Um, and there's really few people that would say don't practice biomedicine, don't go to a biomedical healer, or that biomedical healing is generally ineffective or anything like that. But it seeks to expose its cultural roots, its own conceptual limits and biases. And in some ways, this can lead to some direct criticism of sort of biomedical practices. So this is something we'll pick up in the weeks ahead. And then finally, there's this approach that's they just call applied medical anthropology, which is really the using insights and knowledge of medical anthropology applied to real world situations. It's not a different theory so much, or even an approach really so much, except that it's about application. And when we seek to apply these insights that we gain from medical anthropology to real world conditions, we find that things don't always fit into neat categories. And that the sort of high theory and really nuanced theory always doesn't come across as so relevant with the messiness of dealing with real world situations. And so, part of what applied medical anthro has given us great insights for us is to you know, really understand how when you go to apply these concepts, you have to really, I guess I would say, practice some of the best sorts of anthropology, and you have to figure out a way to sort of make these various ideas and various approaches work to help improve people's well-being. So that's all I'm going to say for this. Next week, we're going to continue our general discussion of approaches, but specifically focus on the biosocial approaches. You have 3 required readings. The chapter by Girolamo that introduces biosocial approaches through an example of a cholera epidemic in Peru, by McCown on determinants of health, and the one by Armelagos et al. On epidemiological transitions, which provides a historical perspective on health and disease. And I'm also going to take a look at the sort of questions that you've raised and at your introductions, and we'll comment on these as we move forward. And so, see you soon.